Thank you. And hi, everyone. It's nice to be here virtually with you all today. So as Cal said, my name is Sam Cheng. I'm the Director for Conservation Evidence within Global Science at the World Wildlife Fund. This is an international environmental nonprofit organization. So in my role, I really work to guide strategy for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and promoting evidence use and robust evidence practice within the organization, as well as for the conservation and development sectors. So, in practice, what this really means is much of my time is spent working with teams across our organization to determine, what we need to measure to understand the effectiveness of conservation, and then determine how we actually measure it in reliable and credible ways. So part of that is focusing on asking better questions, on grounding the designs in best available and most relevant knowledge, and then really aiming to link measures across scales. So a good portion of my work actually focuses on building support, infrastructure, and culture for evidence-informed practice through the development of methods, tools, and guidance. So I'm here to talk today about one of these tools, which is an artificial intelligence tool for evidence synthesis called Colandr. And the lessons that we learned about the importance of balancing humans and machines, and the utility of artificial intelligence for evidence synthesis and pursuing the sustainability of open source tools. Coming to you all today, I realize that perhaps this is a field kind of a left field. Coming from conservation, we're really working across these really complex systems. So we're trying to conserve, individual species, but also the processes and these interlinkages within communities, within ecosystems that ensure overall ecosystem health and sustainability. But we're also trying to work across these systems, across human systems as well as natural systems to really understand how we pursue sustainability for people and for nature in the long term. And so there are multiple ways in which we can plan for conservation development. For example, here we're looking at aquaculture and all the different aspects that are tied into this, from urban areas to aquaculture to farming to recreation. And these are all aspects to consider when we're working to understand what kind of evidence we need to inform conservation. So I just wanted to start this talk off a bit about where I'm coming from and why we need evidence in conservation, how we're using it, and some of the challenges we're running into that I think we all have in common in furthering the use of evidence synthesis in decision making. So for conservation practice to really be effective, our actions need to be supported by the best available evidence. And this includes information on what does work, what does not work, under what conditions does it work, and for whom it works. And so, this is really critical as we try and achieve these co-benefits for nature and for people, that we consider any trade-offs. So evidence from scientific research, from practitioner knowledge, from traditional and local knowledge can contribute to the types of decisions that we're trying to make and to the implementation process itself. In particular, it can provide insight into how we actually design these interventions so that they are specific and relevant to particular contexts and help us achieve our desired objectives. So we have this sort of multi-fold need, So practitioners, such as the ones within my organization, really need digestible insights from research and from broader knowledge. And they also need a framework. So for those who are generating knowledge, who are organizing knowledge, need a framework so they can create and share that information so that we can bring this all together to come to evidence-based decision-making and evidence-informed practice. So, within the context that I'm working in, this is really critical. And it's, I think, critical for a lot of our work is, we're taking on these big global challenges, trying to pursue the UN Sustainable Development Goals, goals like 30 by 30, conserving 30% of the world's ecosystems by 2030, and trying to reach our targets or keep us below our targets for climate change mitigation. And so really what all of these initiatives are trying to do is to target natural ecosystems to address climate change, provide energy and water, to ensure food security and improve global health. So to track progress towards these goals, we'll need that empirical evidence that documents impacts and the mechanisms by which they're achieved. Despite that importance and a really heavy investment in actions to do this, much of the evidence that we have that underlies these assumptions is either lacking or it's unclear. And what this means is it really increases the risk that we're investing in actions that don't work, or worse, they result in negative consequences that we don't expect. So while we know that there's further research needed, we also know that we have decades of conservation research that we're trying to draw from. And so knowing that that evidence is potentially out there, the conservation community was really struggling with how do we actually find it and how do we actually use it. So, in parallel to existing research, we also have this massive capacity to gather data, whether that's by satellites or remote sensing, or more localized devices like camera traps that capture, at regular intervals, pictures of wildlife in remote places. Whoops, apologies. And all that data and all this information can help inform decisions. But we know that not all information can provide evidence. It really depends on the reliability of that information and the needs of the decision itself. But given that global scientific research output is doubling every 9 years, finding that evidence needle in that research haystack is really a big concern. And that sheer glut of papers that are out there for people to potentially review is really overwhelming. So in the conservation field, the number of papers being published each year is growing exponentially. In 2018, there were over 16,000 new papers, in conservation sustainability, just using these terms to look for it. And so, there's a pile of potentially relevant information that's this opportunity for evidence-informed decision-making. But despite all of this, all the articles and the reports are scattered across multiple different sources. They sometimes are inaccessible because they lie behind paywalls, particularly for people who are working in non-academic institutions, or they're buried in the electronic archives of different organizations. And, this article always really struck me. This is published, 8 years ago now. When a report from the World Bank came out saying that of the hundreds and probably thousands of reports that they publish every year, on research, on evaluations from their funded projects, that most of them get filed into their database and they never get downloaded again. I think it was like up to a third, maybe a third had ever been downloaded. And so this article in the Washington Post asked the question of whether or not the solution to all of our problems might actually be buried in a PDF that no one's ever going to read. So if anything, perhaps we have this growing but continually mysterious evidence base. And then, in conservation, the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence and a group of collaborators surveyed a number of respondents in the UK. And they found that there's a really strong desire to use more evidence in decision-making. However, with that data scattered across multiple sources and that lack of access, finding that relevant information became really time-consuming. And for many practitioners like myself and for others at non-research organizations, it's really challenging to be able to do this. So in the absence of being able to access and assess a really more comprehensive evidence base, they found that most respondents based the majority of decision-making on experience rather than on evidence. So how do we then get from that pile to this evidence-informed decision-making? I think you are all familiar with this. One method is through systematic evidence synthesis. And these are, approaches that help us synthesize these key messages on effectiveness from a broad evidence base. These systematic, transparent, reproducible, and peer-reviewed methods are really helpful for us to reliably understand and answer these questions of impact and effectiveness. And while, systematic evidence syntheses have become a standard of practice in medical fields and in public health, and increasingly in social sectors, they're relatively new in the environmental sector. They really only just picked up over the past decade or so. And so the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence sort of stands as a leader in providing comprehensive guidelines on how to actually conduct reviews and maps and provides an open access journal of the resulting publications. And so in my previous position at the American Museum of Natural History, I coordinate the newest CE center that was based in the US, or that is based in the US, still at the museum. And so attention on syntheses has really grown in the environmental field. There are a number of different protocols that are being published now on a variety of different topics and lots of new syntheses. So there really is excitement and sort of attention on the use of these resources. So what I focus on within this area is these evidence synthesis methods called evidence maps or systematic maps, and really focusing on the evidence on nature-people linkages and trying to understand where evidence exists to create policy-relevant guidance for practitioners to be able to find relevant information, and then to also develop practical tools to facilitate the more efficient synthesis and greater access to that information. So I won't really go through this too much in detail, but we know the synthesis process goes something like this. We figure out what, how, and where we're going to search, what we're going to include and exclude, and what data we want to extract. And this is an example of some of the work that I do, and I think for those who are familiar with evidence maps, what the final product sort of looks like. And evidence maps in particular are quite unruly, and they're often quite a behemoth to wrangle with, because they're typically looking at this wide range of interventions and outcomes. And they really aim to provide that comprehensive as well as exhaustive picture of this current state of knowledge. They have multiple uses. They can be a roadmap for us to identify knowledge gaps for future research prioritization. They can help us identify where there are areas that are sort of ripe today, ripe for future investigation, into the mechanisms and the impacts by which outcomes may or may not be achieved. But what they can really help do is reduce the amount of time that evidence seekers or evidence users spend looking for relevant information by collating it all within a policy relevant framework. While there's a lot of attention on evidence synthesis in the environmental field, they're becoming very popular. There's a lot more of them being published. There are some significant challenges to actually conducting them in an efficient way, particularly in sort of global environment that we're in now, with lots of very pressing global challenges that people are trying to address. So this raises the question, are there opportunities for big data and data science and technological approaches to improve the efficiency by which we find and we extract information from these different sources of evidence? So I don't think I need to really explain or sort of convince you all of the efficiency challenge in evidence synthesis for you all who've engaged in this. We are working with an information deluge, with a number of papers that are published every year, and as well as a number of information, the volume of information that is sitting in gray or unpublished literature sources. But despite this, we find that much of the evidence that is out there is not actually relevant to what we're interested, or that our ability to search them is quite inefficient, or some combination thereof. And so we conducted this analysis of published systematic maps and reviews in the Journal of Environmental Evidence. And we found that on average, authors were reading about 14,000 citations, but ultimately only including about 2.5% of those in their final analysis. And so, while these papers were excluded because they were irrelevant or they didn't match the study quality requirements, researchers are still combing through this really large pile of potentially relevant information, or potentially irrelevant information. And so what that comes with is this really labor-intensive process, which raises a significant resource challenge to ensure that the reviews are properly staffed. These estimates are probably a bit old at this point, but the cost of systematic syntheses can range anywhere from $30,000 to $300,000 US. And depending on the scope, they could take several years. And as I mentioned earlier, in the conservation field, we really are working on these very, very urgent timelines where policy decisions about climate change about conservation, about sustainability and sustainable development are being made right now. But we know that there is evidence out there that has not yet been synthesized, that hasn't been included, that hasn't gotten into the hands of decision makers. So our group really experienced this firsthand when we were conducting an evidence map of the links between conservation and human well-being. And we filtered through 35,000 citations manually by scanning titles and abstracts for relevancy, using our inclusion criteria in an Excel spreadsheet. And we ended up excluding the majority of articles and looking at 3,000 full text articles. And then after going through all of those, we ended up with about 1,000 studies in our map. And one of the great values of conducting syntheses in this systematic way is that they can be reliably and consistently updated over time, resulting in that dynamic evidence base. So, the minute you conduct your search is out of date. And under the guidelines from CE, we mandate that reviews should be updated every 3 years. So there really is a need to improve how we screen for evidence in a way that's dynamic. So one of the primary efforts of our group, the Science for Nature and People Partnership Working Group on Evidence-Based Conservation, was to figure out how we improve this process. And so we worked with Conservation International, which is another environmental nonprofit, and a data science nonprofit called DataKind, to develop a tool that harnesses machine learning and natural language processing to make this process faster and more efficient. So in July of 2017, we launched Colandr, which is an open access, open source, computer-assisted application for evidence synthesis. So Colandr was really built on this central and core element to help users find relevant information faster and to be able to intelligently sort through and extract desired information from reports and articles. And so the algorithms that are employed in Colandr dynamically learn what's relevant to the individual user. So its utility, while it's designed for conservation topics, actually extends to all fields of research. But one thing we were really wary of was, whether the lack of transparency in the machine learning process could actually cause problems, particularly as the intention was to use the platform for systematic reviews, which is intended to be an assessment of evidence that accounts for and tries to minimize bias as much as possible. So we knew that whatever solution we came up with needed to be, less rise of the machines kind of scenario and more of a robot that makes your life a little bit easier, even if it's taking your groceries to the car. So what emerged from this was Colandr, which is a semi-automated two-system approach for evidence reviews. And so what Colandr does is it sets up two systems, one for relevance ranking of citations and the other for semi-automated labeling of included documents. So I'm just going to go through a bit about the technical background of Colandr, how it works, how it could be useful, and then talk about some of the challenges of this process itself and some of the lessons we've learned from it. So the first algorithm employed in Colandr is something called word-to-vec. And I'll just apologize in advance. I am not a machine learning scientist by training. So we'll dive into this a little bit, but possibly not get as technical as maybe others would. So it takes, for example, this sentence. It says, I like NLP and I love cats. That is not untrue. And what word-to-vec does is it calculates the adjacency of words in a sentence. So for example, in this sentence, love would be more closely associated with cats than like would be. And how this is employed within Colandr is it uses it to identify co-occurrences of words across your citations that you upload. So it looks for co-occurrences of words around your key terms that you define as the user. So here you can see those key terms in bold. And then it learns which terms are more often found around your key terms in your included citations versus in your excluded ones. And then it ranks the unscreened citations according to relevance. So we use this Word2Vec algorithm in Colandr's first system. So you would input a citation list, so one that you would export from a publication database or from a citation manager. And then Colandr will apply Word2Vec to sort your citations first by their predicted relevance according to the adjacency to your keywords. And then based on what you screened and indicated as relevant and not relevant, the model then reruns after every 10 citations screened and improves sort of that relevance over time. So as you go through, you should see more citations that are relevant to you. So after you've come up with your list of citations, these are the ones you've included, the second system of Colandr employs natural language processing and machine learning to help semi-automate the metadata labeling or extraction process. So in this system, after the users manually extracted data from 50 included articles, the system will then suggest different labels for different papers based on a user-defined set of labels. So in this case, we're labeling papers by the type of conservation intervention that's about and what type of human well-being outcome is being measured. And so it suggests those labels with high or low confidence. And then you as a user then have to choose which labels to apply. And so what's happening here in this part of the application is that the system's actually over predicting. So it's predicting sentences from a very large number of labels so that the system can focus on recall while the human annotators can focus on precision, what it actually is. And so for locations, we use something called a named entity recognition system. And this finds mentioned locations in the documents and suggests those as labels, right? If you're interested in geographically labeling your documents. And then for other metadata, we use an algorithm called GLOVE, which stands for Global Vectors for Word Representation, and a logistic regression model to actually train the model of tags that you're trying to apply to your papers. And what it does is it calculates the probability of certain words given the presence of other words. First, based on what the user's already labeled, along with a global corpus, right, of the English language and word meaning. So for example, if people normally describe cats as fuzzy, and so this is deriving from that global corpus. And in our study, we flag articles as a cat article when they talk about fuzzy and adorable. The system would then have a higher confidence in suggesting a cat label for articles that consistently use fuzzy and adorable words that are closely adjacent to the cat words. So the system is limited to English only at the moment. And so then what the system does is it shows sentences that best predict the labels to the user. So the user can then look at the sentence and determine whether or not this is the correct label for it. So since we launched Colandr in 2017, it's grown significantly. We have over 4,000 active users and nearly 3,000 active reviews in a whole number of different topics. So, as I've been saying, we built Colandr with a conservation topic in mind. We had a very specific need within the conservation community to efficiently find evidence relevant to conservation practice. But what we created in the end was a platform that's domain agnostic. And so we have reviews across a whole diversity of questions and disciplines, sort of illustrated here in this word cloud. And so Colandr's users are quite a diverse crowd. These are just a couple of examples of groups who are using it for different purposes. So a group called the iSeal Alliance is using it to extract information about the impacts of certification of different natural resource products. And then, on the other side of that, the American College of Physicians has been interested in using the algorithms that drive Colandr to help improve synthesis in medicine, to learn from the codes and the algorithms that we used. And then within the Science for Nature and People partnership, SNAP itself, this has become a tool that working groups, for example, the Ecological Drought Group, a group working on soil carbon, and a group working on ecological levers for health can really find and synthesize evidence and inform the research and solutions that they're focused on. So, to some extent, we've addressed that first challenge of applying technology to improve efficiency. But, within that, there's a second related challenge. When can you actually stop screening? So the idea with Colandr is that it should sift through relevant citations and get the ones that you want to the top, while the irrelevant ones fall to the bottom. And theoretically, you could ignore the ones on the bottom, which would help you save time and resources. But unlike other machine learning powered review platforms, Colandr doesn't automatically sort citations into groups of included and excluded. And it doesn't tell you that there are no more relevant citations remaining. And I'll talk a little bit about the rationale behind that in a minute. And, in general, within evidence synthesis practice across all disciplines, there's actually really little guidance on when it's okay to stop screening. Determining when your stopping points are, whether it's, you've screened 50% or 90% of the citations that you've uncovered, really depends on the individual review. And each review team really needs to determine what their level of acceptable risk is. So what's the risk that you're missing evidence that is actually relevant in relation to the type of decision that synthesis is actually intended to inform. So for example, a synthesis that intends to inform a really high risk, high uncertainty decision, you may want to be a bit more comprehensive to really ensure that you're capturing all available information and nuance. And then conversely, a decision that is, maybe low risk and it's quite high uncertainty, maybe you're interested in exploring a new space for innovation. Maybe you're willing to miss some information. If your intention is to be more comprehensive, to sort of grab a bigger part of the landscape than to be exhaustive. So, one thing we've been doing with Colandr is determining how efficient is it really? How quickly does it help us find relevant citations to help us understand how to determine when a potential stopping point could be and guidance around doing that. And so a group at Duke University at the Marine Lab and the Nicholas School of Environment has been working with us at WWF through the BAS Connections program to do some of this testing. And so they've been running this data set through with ocean conservation gap map data, evidence map data. And they're comparing the active learning that happens in Colandr, indicated here in the orange, and then active learning with a training data set of included and excluded citations, things we already knew from a previous review. And comparing that to the efficiency for a control where there is no machine learning at all, and to citations sorted in a random order. And so as you can see in these graphs here, that the time it takes, the number of citations that you actually have to look at to get to your number of true included citations is much faster when you look at the green and the orange lines. But there isn't really much difference, at least in this test, between machine learning and machine learning with the training data set. So this is encouraging. We know that it is more efficient than random. And so what we've done with this is that this preliminary data indicated that we tended to observe this leveling off point when no more relevant citations were being returned as we continue to screen, right? So it's starting to level off there. However, given the diversity of topics that Colandr users are working within, our examples really were only illustrative of the conservation discipline. But comparing to what others have found in medicine and in physics, there are some similar trends. And so what we've done is to help users navigate some of these complexities and better track their own review progress. We've created a platform called the Colandr Companion that runs alongside Colandr, and it allows users to track their inclusion rate and observe when they might be reaching a point of sort of diminishing returns. So where your rate of inclusion is declining, indicating that you may or may not have reached a stopping point, depending on what you've defined that as. And this app also allows for some review management tasks where you can track users across your review. If you can calculate your inclusion rate over different intervals of citations screened. And you can also look at the tags that you've applied to citations. So some users were interested in pre-tagging their citations before they got to data extraction, just to start to do some preliminary categorization. And then lastly, there are some export features on the companion that allows you to export bespoke data sets, as well as citation files, formatted citation files that are sort of more detailed than what you can export from the main platform. So I've talked a lot about Colandr and its features and sort of how great we thought it is and how it's performed. And it really has done a lot to improve the review process. But the question really still remains, is the application of machine learning and natural language processing really the solution, right, for these efficiency challenges in large scale evidence synthesis? And I think from our experience and our experience from the conservation sector, it's quite complicated still. So there are a couple problems here. The first is that machine learning algorithms only perform as well as the data that goes into them. So the abstracts that we feed into Colandr are, if they're really vague, if they're really poorly written, it's going to be more difficult for the algorithms to determine their relevance. So you put it this way, if you as a human reading it are not entirely sure what the abstract is about, then the machine likely is not going to either. And then on that same vein, if an abstract overpromises what that paper is about, if it sounds really relevant, but when you get to the paper, it's not relevant, that's still an inefficient process. But that's not at the fault of the machine learning algorithm. It's the quality of the data that's gone into it. And the second problem is when we have situations where we have really variable semantics or variable terminology, it becomes harder for algorithms to predict relevance or predict the types of topics it might be about. So in conservation, this is particularly a sort of key issue because new terms are often created with very little standardization about what they mean or clear definition boundaries between different terms. So for example, this sort of word cloud here is generated as part of a study that it was looking at the landscape of community engagement approaches used in biodiversity conservation. And we found that there's a lot of overlap between a lot of these terms, both in what the term actually is, but also in their definitions. And there was very rarely any kind of accepted definition for one over the other. So with another example here, these are the types of terms that are being used to describe a body of literature that examines ways to bridge the science action sort of gap in conservation and sustainability. And you can see that there are some terms that are really commonly used, but others are much more rarely used, but are still present. And so the ability of a machine learning model to learn from an uneven data set is also really challenging. So on the one hand, attempts to create and enforce some kind of standard lexicon can be helpful. The mesh terms in the medical field are widely used to describe studies, but this raises another challenge in that, for medical terminology, this is often quite narrowly defined. There are clear definitions that are more universal. So for example, on that last slide, the flu was influenza. Influenza doesn't necessarily mean something else somewhere else. But, there are other types of terminologies and ways of describing the world around us that can't be standardized to that same degree of granularity. An example from the conservation field is that typing in the word conservation gets you things like nature conservation. It gets you things like the conservation of energy. And it also gets you things like archival conservation for museum samples. 3 very different fields, but all that use the word conservation to mean different things. And then at the same time, as we try and widen the body of knowledge that we can draw from that's considered for decision making, standardizing terminology becomes an issue of equity and an issue of power. So we can't standardize the way in which we talk about things when we're bringing together traditional knowledge and other types of knowledge that are out there. So then, what does this really mean? I think if we want to use machine learning to play that bigger role in classifying text in fields like conservation and sustainability, there needs to be some standardization of the ontologies we're using, but perhaps not through these very, very stringent rules, but through efforts to serve more of a thesaurus, right? To help us cross-relate terms. And there are some efforts that are out there in conservation. There are typologies that are being developed and being used by the International Union of Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. But, again, more often than not, these typologies really do reflect certain viewpoints in certain disciplines. So we need to have a greater diversity of viewpoints to inform this full development of a semantic web for conservation so that it can be inclusive and it can be equitable and can accurately reflect, the diversity of knowledge that's out there. So in the meantime, Colandr is going to continue to work on that semi-automated basis to keep that human in the machine so that we can retain user oversight and we can minimize the chances that relevant information is perhaps outside of that mainstream terminology doesn't get overlooked. So the last thing that I want to close with today is a brief discussion of the challenges and opportunities that we encountered in the lessons we learned about building an open source app, of any flavor, really, machine learning or not. So one of the things, in building Colandr and building this user community, we've had a really amazing opportunity to crowdsource innovation. So the user community has identified ways in which they would like to improve both the evidence synthesis process itself, which has led to people getting more involved in evidence synthesis methodology and in research, and getting involved with the groups that are doing this work, such as CE and such as Campbell. And from the outputs from Colandr itself. And so different members of the user community have been building tools in things like R to convert output files, to provide some of that tracking that we featured earlier, and provide some of those analytics. And then the second opportunity that we sort of learned about is, we've really been able to share these innovations and the lessons that we've learned from building Colandr quite openly. When we built Colandr, the applications that were out there in the evidence synthesis world that use machine learning were there, but the processes by which they ran those models were really opaque. And so there was a lot of groundwork and sort of research on our end to scope out what a machine learning approach would look like, what kind of algorithms should we use, the performance of those models by our development team in order to actually get Colandr off the ground. And so what we wanted to do was to make sure that what we've done could contribute to progress in the field, so that groups who are interested in doing machine learning and applying it to evidence synthesis wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So that's our commitment to open source, and that's how we built Colandr. And so that code is available on GitHub, to be used, to be viewed, to be picked apart by anyone who's interested. But one of the greatest challenges we encountered in Colandr is a challenge that all apps really face. How do you actually maintain that app in the long term? So when we built Colandr, Colandr was built by a team of volunteer data scientists who took time out of their days, as graduate students, as professional data scientists, to build Colandr on their nights and weekends, because they were interested in using data science for some kind of social problem. And currently, Colandr is maintained by volunteer staff, myself being one of them. And, we're hosted on an Amazon web server for that flexibility and that maintenance. And we've been really lucky that our core costs for, maintaining the app, making the updates and answering the emails are all supported by a donor from the American Museum of Natural History. And because otherwise, trying to find funding for core costs is actually quite difficult, especially in the long term via grants that tend to focus on innovation and building something new. And, the last thing is that, like many apps, we struggle with how we're going to keep up with developments. We're a free to use platform. It's run by a group of nonprofit organizations. And we want to maintain this free to use model because, one of our objectives with Colandr, the vision here is to ensure accessibility to tools for evidence synthesis so that we can grow global capacity for evidence synthesis. But this also means we're kind of limited in how we address bug fixes, how we address new features and sort of bringing Colandr and evolving it over time, which has really just forced us to be a bit more creative in how we approach long-term planning and long-term development. So in conclusion, our experience running and developing Colandr has taught us a lot about how we can improve the overall evidence pipeline, from the generation of information to the synthesis of evidence to its actual use. And if anything, Colandr has really shown us that an open source model really allows us to maximize cross connectivity between applications, which then means we can sort of leverage the potential of this entire landscape of tools for evidence synthesis instead of trying to build a single do-it-all platform, and really harness that creativity and the energy of our growing user community. So machine learning approaches really have this huge potential to help us make progress towards evidence-informed decision-making. But in developing Colandr, we also found that applying machine learning and applying natural language processing needs to be done carefully, both in the risk of relying on automated processes and how that can impact the reliability of both the platform as well as the synthesis itself, but also thinking about the challenges of the quality and the type of data we use to inform these models, particularly in considering that what we feed into the model and how we set it up is inclusive and equitable to the types of information that we're trying to harness. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm happy to take questions. I've put the links to Colandr and the Colandr community website that has help, guidance and how-tos and all sorts of things, and the link to the Colandr companion, as well as my email and the email for the Colandr team. And thank you to all of our funding supporters. And thank you to all you.
Thank you so much, Sam. So we have two questions. I actually have quite a bit of questions, but I'll leave my questions for the end. Really great presentation. I loved all your slides, and Colandr seems like such a great contribution to the community and to bring people together to do better systematic reviews. So thank you. So I'll take the first question from Krista, who asks, this is a very interesting tool. Oh, actually, so sorry, before that, I think we should launch the poll before doing the question. So thank you, Ciprian. So could everybody just take a moment and fill in the poll for this 1 minute that it'll take to do that, and then we'll kind of summarize the results.
We'll keep the poll open until the end, so take your time.
Okay.
Just before you leave, we would appreciate if you answer these 5 questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So Chris asked, this is a very interesting tool. I wonder whether a librarian has been involved in your approach.
That's a great question. We have worked with librarians and information specialists for our own reviews when we're thinking about which search terms to use, how to put them together, where to search. But we haven't really worked with a librarian to develop the machine learning and the natural language processing parts of Colandr. But I think that's a really interesting suggestion as we think about future Colandr developments, right? Like, can we improve the corpus, right, that people are working in? I think the challenge is that Colandr is used for all sorts of topics. And so we'd have to figure out how that would work, but I'd be interested to hear more from you, as if you're a librarian, or from others who are here who have had that experience.
So our next question is from Sharad Sue, who asked, Dear Samantha, thank you for sharing this interesting information. Do you know if machine learning can be used to extract data and doing meta-analysis?
Yes, it can. So in Colandr, we use machine learning for the automated data labeling or the metadata labeling, right, of your papers. But there are tools that are out there that can be used for extracting data from meta-analysis. I can't recall the names of the tools off the top of my head, but they are listed on places like Systematic Review Toolbox. And I believe there have been a couple of papers that have evaluated sort of the reliability and the performance of these for extracting, right, numbers from graphs and whatnot.
Great. So just to clarify for everybody, so when you mean metadata labeling, so this is when you have like a database and you like kind of find your key terms, you put your key terms into a database. In medicine, it would be like, Medline, for example. You take that Medline data and you actually put it into Colandr, and Colandr helps you with the screening process, right? Deciding if this study is included or excluded.
Yes, so there's two parts of that. So the key terms that you put into Medline, you could put in as your key terms in Colandr, and that would help you with the first part of screening through your citations for relevance. The second part, when you actually have your papers that you're interested in extracting data from, say you're interested in a pile of data, and it's about the use of different types of interventions to treat sciatica. I'm pulling things out of my head here. So what you'd be interested, right, in coding from those papers would be the type of intervention, like the intervention category, perhaps the demographics of the subjects, maybe the study design, maybe where the study took place, the year the study was published, and maybe the types of measures they use to determine effectiveness. And so those are all categorical fields of data. And so what Colandr can help you do is label that type of categorical data. And what's great is that you can define whatever categories you want, and it will then learn about those categories based on the word adjacency model. Again, the challenge is if you're working in a really vague field, as I tend to be, right, especially now we're talking about the ability of nature to help us mitigate climate change. There are new terms, there are things like nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions and ecosystem risk reduction. And, when you start to dig into it, you're like, these are all kind of similar. And so trying to figure out what is often more of a theoretical and conceptual challenge the researchers have to deal with before the machine learning can handle it.
Yeah, right. And so does that mean can you input like PDFs of all types of studies and be able to kind of ask Colandr to label those as well? Or is it only for certain types of studies? Like, is it only for randomized controlled trials or say cohort studies, or is it any type of study design?
It's any type of study design. And, coming from conservation, we very rarely have randomized controlled trials.
Oh, I see.
Lots of observational, lots of, non-experimental studies, but we've also had users, use Colandr to screen through evaluation reports and reports from organizations, to try and look at general trends. We used it to screen through a whole number of US government reports about the impacts of COVID on projects.
Sounds amazing.
They're just PDFs with words in it, and that's essentially what the document labeling is doing.
Oh, great. Actually, yeah, because I have a project that I think would be very useful for that if I can input the PDFs into Colandr.
Yeah, it does require you to pre-label, right, the first 50. So if you have more than 50 papers, it does. It's useful. If you have less than 50 papers, you might as well just do it by hand. And the one thing I will say is that if you're starting to do nested labeling, right, if a paper talks about 3 different interventions and measures 3 different things, and you want to make sure that those are all linked together, it is not as useful to use Colandr for those purposes, because that nested labeling isn't available yet.
Yeah. So I had a question about, so you said you could do the screening Colandr from importing like a search strategy or having Colandr like kind of, get your search up. So if that's the case, so one of the issues that we both know from systematic reviews is the issue of missing studies. So that would be like, say for example, publication bias, or, studies that are in the gray literature, for example, that might not be identified readily. But also there's the issue of like, when you're screening, that there could be studies that got excluded by mistake, right? Like either by the person who's doing the screening or maybe by the machine. Have you done any kind of analysis on that? Like whether like studies were excluded that should have potentially been included?
So in this case, any studies that were excluded that should have been included will be at the fault of the reviewer. The fault of the user, because we retain that user oversight. Colandr will never say this study is excluded and you're not going to see it. It's just going to go in a pile. What can happen is if it gets deprioritized and it's like all the way at the end of your list and you decide you're going to stop screening, then you could miss it. And so that's what some of the trials that the team at Duke University is doing. And they've been running through it with like larger and larger data sets to see, okay, if we screen these and then we establish a cutoff point, what's the likelihood that what's left behind actually includes included data? And for most it's pretty low. And they're running 500 study data sets right now. But again, I think it depends on the variability in your field. I've had it perform really well when I was just looking for papers about squid fisheries management, because it's very clear I wanted squid, and not papers about the giant axon of squid for neuroscience studies. But when the topic is a little more broad or it's more nuanced, then that's when you kind of have to watch your inclusion rate and see how it's going and how it might be changing over time.
All right, great. Yeah, that sounds good. So those papers will come out and show you like an error rate, basically like 5% or whatever it's going to be, or lower, hopefully.
Hopefully. And what we really actually need is for people to help us do this testing. And as I mentioned, Colandr is primarily run by volunteers, and it's also, the tools and the developments that are coming up, and then the sort of the add-ons and the complementary tools are being built by other users. And so we're also asking users who are interested in helping us test the efficiency of Colandr for different fields to get in contact with us. We have a protocol of how you do it and how you and just keeping track of all that data, and we're hoping that we get more information so we can really pinpoint those stopping points. But yeah.
And you said that Colandr's you've used the crowd to be able to put this together. You said volunteers, but also just anybody who wants to get involved, right? And how has there been challenges around that? Like, how do you train people that are just maybe not specialists?
Yeah, so really we're relying on people to come to us. So we've had a couple of scientists from another NGO were like, hey, we love Colandr. We discovered when we exported the file that we need to tweak it a little bit to get it to be read by this other program. We're going to guess other people have that issue. So we created this this conversion script that people can just download and run on their export file. They had some coding experience, right? They had the ability to do that. And so we were able to integrate that into the companion later on. By building that. But the data scientists who helped us build Colandr goes through this organization called DataKind, which is a nonprofit, right, that helps data scientists get connected to organizations that need help. And we need a lot of data help.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. We're thinking about, so I'm going to be putting in a grant. This is like, we'll have 2 more minutes, but we will show the results of the poll in just 1 more minute. But we want to develop a similar kind of grant app, but to be able to assess the biases in systematic reviews, actually. So where users could just input like a bunch of PDFs on reviews that are similar, because we have the same issue, where there's too much information and people can't choose between the systematic reviews on the same topic. And so we're proposing to do an app where that would just assess the biases in systematic reviews, which is actually part of what Colandr could currently do, right? Which you said, like the data labeling. So
yeah, you could certainly do that. I think it could help you figure out, right, as you're going through and labeling papers for different biases, and you could calibrate it right to your own requirements, because it's all user defined. But to that end, it might be interesting for those who are interested in looking at quality, reliability, and quality of reviews. The Collaboration for Environmental Evidence has released what we call the database of evidence reviews, where we are screening, a team of volunteers again is screening through every published review, systematic or not, in the environmental sector from 2018 onwards, 2019 onwards, and scoring them based on the reporting of their methodology, using a sort of an appraisal tool. And so that's available for folks if you're interested. It's CEEDER, but focus on the environmental space.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Cheng. And we really look forward to hearing more updates about Colandr, because it seems like just such a wonderful tool, actually.
Thank you for having me. It's been great chatting with you all. And please let me know if you have any questions and reach out.